On the night of February 12, 1976, the lights of Hollywood were still on. Cars passed. Music played somewhere behind closed doors. But in a narrow alley behind an apartment building in West Hollywood, one of the most recognizable faces of 1950s American cinema was bleeding alone. Sal Mineo had just returned home. Minutes earlier, he had been on stage, chasing a comeback that never quite arrived. Minutes later, he was lying on cold pavement, stabbed once in the chest. The attack lasted seconds. The questions it created have lasted decades. Why was a former Hollywood star walking alone through a dark alley that night? Why did help come too late, in a neighborhood surrounded by people? And why did the official explanation, a random mugging, never fully silence the unease that followed his death? Sal Mineo was once everywhere. A teenage icon. An Oscar-nominated actor. A symbol of rebellion, desire, and danger in post-war America. Yet his final moments unfolded far from cameras, far from applause, far from protection. This is not a story about fame rising. It is a story about how fame fades, and what happens in the hours when the world is no longer watching. In the minutes before Sal Mineo took his final breath, Hollywood was close enough to touch. And still, he died unseen. What really happened in those final hours? And how did a life once lived under blinding studio lights end in complete darkness? The news broke quietly at first. In the early hours of February 13, 1976, police confirmed that Sal Mineo was dead. 37 years old. Pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. Within hours, the shock rippled outward. For the general public, his name triggered a distant recognition, the brooding boy from Rebel Without a Cause, the dangerous beauty of a different Hollywood era. For the industry, it landed heavier. Mineo was not a forgotten extra. He was a former Oscar nominee. A man whose face once defined youthful rebellion on American screens. And now, the headlines were blunt. Actor Sal Mineo slain in alley. Former film star killed in apparent mugging. One stab wound. No witnesses. The simplicity of the language felt unsettling. There was no dramatic chase. No prolonged struggle. No famous last words. Just a single knife wound. Just a dark alley. Just a body discovered too late. Hollywood had seen violent deaths before, but this one felt different. Not explosive. Not spectacular. Quiet. Personal. Almost disposable. The reaction among colleagues was immediate and uneasy. Friends described Mineo as cautious, not reckless. He had survived Hollywood's brutal machinery, its scandals, its shifting tastes. He had rebuilt himself for the stage, taking smaller roles, working harder, refusing to disappear. Yet he had been killed steps from his own door. The randomness disturbed people. If a man who once moved in the company of legends could die this way, without protection, without witnesses, what did that say about the safety fame was supposed to provide? The press moved quickly to frame the story. Police sources suggested a robbery gone wrong. A mugger. A panicked attacker. A tragic coincidence. But questions surfaced almost immediately. Why was nothing taken? Why only one wound, delivered with fatal precision? Why did neighbors report hearing cries, yet no one arrived in time? And beneath the surface, there was another layer no headline wanted to linger on. He had faced harassment, threats, and violence before. In 1976, that context mattered, even if it was rarely printed. As reporters gathered facts, Hollywood processed something more unsettling than a murder. This was the death of a man who had outlived his moment of fame, but never escaped its shadow. A man trying to return to the spotlight, cut down just as he stepped out of the darkness. The shock was not just that Sal Mineo was dead. It was how easily the world seemed ready to move on. Long before the alley. Long before the knife. Sal Mineo had already lived several lives. He was born in 1939, in the Bronx, the son of Italian immigrants, raised in a working-class neighborhood where toughness mattered and sensitivity did not. From an early age, Mineo stood out, not because he tried to, but because he couldn't help it. He was small, intense, expressive. A child who felt everything too deeply. Acting came early, first on stage, then on television. By his mid-teens, Hollywood noticed what Broadway already knew: this boy had electricity. There was something restless behind his eyes, something dangerous and vulnerable at the same time. In 1955, that intensity found its perfect role. Rebel Without a Cause turned Sal Mineo into a cultural symbol overnight. As Plato, the fragile outsider orbiting James Dean's charisma, Mineo embodied an entire generation's anxiety. He wasn't the hero. He wasn't the villain. He was the wound. Audiences didn't just watch him, they recognized themselves in him. At 17, Mineo received an Academy Award nomination. Fame came fast, loud, and permanent. Studios marketed him as a teenage idol. Fan mail poured in. His face was everywhere. But Hollywood had no blueprint for what Sal Mineo actually was. He was too emotional to be a traditional leading man. Too queer-coded for the rigid masculinity of the era. Too honest for an industry built on denial. As he grew older, the roles shrank. The same intensity that once made him unforgettable now made executives uncomfortable. Hollywood wanted clean heroes, not complicated souls. Mineo was neither safe nor easily controllable. By the early 1960s, the offers slowed. Teen idols aged out. Audiences moved on. The studio system quietly turned its back. Mineo did not vanish, but he drifted. He took character roles. Television guest spots. Stage work. He reinvented himself repeatedly, refusing to disappear quietly. On Broadway and regional theater stages, he found something Hollywood never gave him: space to be fully human. But the price of survival was high. Mineo lived under constant scrutiny. His sexuality, once an open secret, became a source of danger rather than gossip. He endured arrests, harassment, and violence, reminders that the world outside the screen was far less forgiving than the one inside it. Still, he kept working. In the years leading up to his death, Mineo was chasing something fragile but real: a second act. Not superstardom, relevance. Respect. Proof that he was more than a relic of 1950s rebellion. By 1976, he was back on stage, earning strong notices, rehearsing relentlessly, walking home late after performances. He was tired. He was hopeful. He was vulnerable. And without knowing it, he was approaching the final stretch of a life spent navigating between visibility and danger, a balance that would finally break in the darkness behind his own apartment. By the mid-1970s, Sal Mineo was no longer fighting for stardom. He was fighting for stability. The industry he had entered as a teenager had changed, and so had the rules. The rebellious sensitivity that once made him unforgettable now existed on the margins. Roles for men like Mineo, emotionally exposed, ambiguous, nonconforming, were scarce. Hollywood preferred spectacle. It preferred youth that could be controlled, masculinity that could be sold without explanation. Mineo adapted the only way he knew how: he worked harder. He directed theater. He acted in small productions. He accepted parts that paid less and demanded more. Night after night, he walked onto stages where the applause was smaller but more sincere. The spotlight was no longer blinding, but it was real. Yet beneath that perseverance, pressure accumulated. Money was inconsistent. Opportunities were fragile. And safety was never guaranteed. Mineo lived openly in a world that was not designed to protect him. He had been assaulted before. He had received threats. He knew what it meant to be followed, to be watched, to be targeted, not by fame, but by hostility. Friends later said he was cautious, alert to his surroundings. He avoided obvious risks. He trusted few people fully. But caution can only go so far when the danger is structural, when simply existing as yourself places you in harm's way. There was also the quiet weight of being remembered for a single moment in time. No matter what he accomplished afterward, interviews returned to the same questions. Rebel without a cause. James Dean. The boy he once was. The icon he no longer resembled. For some, nostalgia is comforting. For others, it is suffocating. Mineo carried the awareness that his most famous work lay decades behind him. That his legacy had been written early, before he had a chance to finish becoming himself. Still, he did not retreat. In early 1976, he was appearing in a stage production in Los Angeles. Reviews were solid. Audiences responded. The routine was demanding but grounding: rehearsals, performances, late nights, familiar streets walked again and again. He was rebuilding his life around work, around discipline, around survival. What no one could see, what no script ever captures, was how exposed that routine made him. How predictable. How vulnerable. Every night ended the same way. A walk home. A quiet building. An alley behind it. In a city that never truly sleeps, Sal Mineo moved through darkness most people never notice, until it swallows someone whole. The collapse was not sudden. It was gradual. Invisible. Accumulated over years. And it was heading toward a moment that would last less than a minute, but define the rest of his story forever. In the days leading up to February 12, 1976, nothing about Sal Mineo's life suggested an ending was imminent. There were no dramatic announcements. No farewell interviews. No sudden disappearances. Instead, there was routine. Mineo was immersed in his stage work, showing up on time, rehearsing with focus, performing night after night. Colleagues later recalled him as professional, engaged, even optimistic. He talked about future projects. He spoke about directing. He made plans that extended beyond the week, beyond the month. This was not a man preparing to die. But there were subtler signals, details that only gain weight in retrospect. Mineo had mentioned feeling watched. He was careful about his movements. He avoided unnecessary risks, especially at night. Friends knew he disliked walking alone after performances, but practicality often overruled caution. Theater schedules ended late. Taxis were unreliable. The walk from the parking area to his apartment had become familiar, almost automatic. Familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort dulls alertness. On the evening of February 12, Mineo finished his performance as usual. There were no reports of arguments backstage, no visible distress, no indication that the night would be different from dozens before it. After the show, he left the theater and returned to his neighborhood in West Hollywood. The streets were active. The city was awake. Nothing felt immediately dangerous. But as he approached his apartment building, he took the same shortcut he always did, the narrow alley behind the property. It was quicker. It was quieter. It was poorly lit. Neighbors later said they heard sounds that didn't register at first. A brief shout. A sudden disturbance. Nothing prolonged enough to demand immediate action. In a city filled with noise, the line between urgency and background sound is thin. Mineo never made it inside. What happened next unfolded in seconds. There was no prolonged struggle reported. No chase. No multiple wounds. Just a single, precise stab to the chest, delivered with enough force to be fatal, but not chaotic enough to suggest panic. By the time help arrived, the window had closed. Mineo was transported to the hospital, but the injury had already done its work. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The finality of it was shocking. A life shaped by intensity, controversy, resilience, and survival ended without ceremony, on concrete, behind his own home. And almost immediately, the story hardened into something simpler than reality. A mugging. A random act. Wrong place, wrong time. But as the night receded into memory, questions lingered. Because randomness rarely feels this precise. And violence rarely leaves so little behind. The final days of Sal Mineo did not announce themselves as tragic. They unfolded quietly, predictably, until the moment they didn't. And now, the clock was about to rewind one last time. Back to the final 24 hours. By morning, the alley behind Sal Mineo's apartment was empty again. The body was gone. The blood had been washed away. Life in West Hollywood resumed. But the case did not close with the sunrise. Police quickly announced a working theory: a robbery gone wrong. A random mugging. A senseless act of street violence in a city that had seen too much of it already. The explanation was efficient. Reassuring. Contained. Yet even as it settled into headlines, it failed to settle the unease. Investigators noted that Mineo's wallet was still on him. There was no clear sign of a struggle beyond the single wound. No witnesses who could provide a usable description. The attack appeared both abrupt and precise, an odd combination for a panicked mugging. Within weeks, police arrested a suspect, a young man with a criminal record who later confessed to the stabbing. He claimed it was an attempted robbery, that he acted impulsively, that he did not know who Mineo was. On paper, the case was solved. In public, it was closed. But for many, the questions lingered. Why was there only one wound? Why did no one intervene sooner, despite reported cries for help? Why did the neighborhood, busy, populated, awake, fail to interrupt the violence? And beneath all of that, there was a question few wanted to articulate openly in 1976. Did Sal Mineo play a role in how he died? Mineo had been targeted before. He had been assaulted years earlier, beaten in an incident widely believed to be motivated by hatred rather than theft. He lived with the knowledge that visibility could invite violence, that being known did not mean being protected. The official narrative never addressed this context directly. It did not need to. The era did not encourage such conversations. Violence against queer men was rarely framed as systemic. It was individualized, minimized, explained away. The trial passed with little fanfare. The conviction satisfied legal requirements. Closure was offered, but it felt procedural, not emotional. For friends and colleagues, the loss landed differently. They spoke of a man who was careful. A man who avoided unnecessary danger. A man who understood risk better than most. That made the randomness of his death harder to accept. And for Hollywood, there was an uncomfortable silence. No sweeping memorial. No industry-wide reckoning. No sustained conversation about safety, visibility, or responsibility. Sal Mineo's death was absorbed into the background noise of the city he once helped define. The investigation ended. The questions did not. Even decades later, the story resists neat resolution, not because the facts are entirely unknown, but because the meaning remains unresolved. Was it truly random? Was it preventable? Was it inevitable in a world that offered fame without protection? The answers depend on where you stand. But one thing is clear. Sal Mineo did not simply die in an alley. He died at the intersection of celebrity, vulnerability, and a society unprepared to protect those who no longer fit its image. And that intersection is where his final hours continue to echo. In the days after Sal Mineo's death, the city moved on faster than it should have. There were brief tributes. Short obituaries. A familiar framing, former teen idol, supporting actor, tragic victim. Hollywood has always been efficient at reducing people to digestible summaries once they are gone. But Sal Mineo's life resisted that kind of simplification. He was never meant to last as a static image. Not the sensitive boy from Rebel Without a Cause. Not the troubled youth the press later fixated on. And certainly not the quiet figure fading into the background of a changing industry. Mineo had been reinventing himself again in the years before his death, working on stage, directing, teaching, pushing forward in spaces where authenticity mattered more than marketability. He was finding something steadier than fame, purpose. That is what makes his final hours so unsettling. There was no grand farewell. No final performance. No public reckoning. Just an ordinary night. A walk home. A moment that should have passed unnoticed, and didn't. In hindsight, his story becomes less about how he died, and more about how he lived with risk long before that night. About what it meant to exist visibly in an industry and a society that demanded honesty from artists, but punished them for practicing it too openly. Sal Mineo paid for that contradiction quietly, over years. The alley in West Hollywood was only where the story ended, not where it began. Today, his legacy exists in fragments. In performances that still feel startlingly modern. In the courage it took to live truthfully before the world was ready to allow it. In the warning embedded in his final hours, that talent and recognition do not guarantee safety, and that progress often arrives too late for those who push it forward. When we look back at Sal Mineo's last moments, we are not just rewinding the clock on a single life. We are confronting a question that remains uncomfortably current. What does it cost to be seen, really seen, in a world that offers applause, but not protection? For Sal Mineo, the answer came too soon. And it came in silence.